Maseches Nedarim Daf Yud Gimel takes us to the end of the first part of the Masechta that begins the second. We'll have two Mishnayos at the end of the first part and one Mishnah in the beginning of the second. The first topic is also the last topic, which is in the Daf, and that is the concept of somebody who wants to make a neder, wants to answer something by linking it to a dover ha'aser. Does it work or not? The Gemara is going to begin by showing that this is actually machlokes, and the Gemara will discuss the sources of these two things. So let's begin the daf. We've seen, and we're going to see later in the daf as well, that if somebody wants to aser an apple, he wants to make a neder to declare that an apple is aser to him, he can do that by linking that to another forbidden object, but only to an object which is forbidden by neder, not an object which is innately forbidden. Now the Gemara has just said that this is a machlokes, and there are some who hold that he can do that. Now, the Gemara is going to give the sources of it, but before we do, we have to divide it up into four categories of something being usher because of neder or innately. So the most innate of isurim would be something which has never changing status and you have nothing to do with creating the status, like nevela treifa. You have meat which is non-kosher meat because it's meat of a nevela or a treifa. That's 100% the davar usher. On that, the Rishonim explain there is no machlokes. Somebody who says an apple is that this apple is like a nevela or a treva that is not chal. It can only be matfis and neder onto something by comparing it to something which you've created the isser on it. Now, the next level below that would be a bachar. Now, a bachar, you don't have a choice in making a bachar aser. A bachar, from the moment that it's born, it has an automatic isser on it. However, you do get to be makdish it. Again, it has kedusha, but you have a mitzvah to be makdish it anyway. And it's a kedusha that comes onto it. It's not necessarily up to you, but it comes onto it as part of its being a carbon, and it gets a heter at some point. So therefore, that is more like a neder, and more likely that it could be that you could be matvis a neder onto your apple by comparing it to a bukhar. So we'll call that level 3. So the highest level, nevelas and neshevos, will be at level 4. Everyone agrees you cannot be matfis to that. Bukhar will call level 3, and there is a subject of a machlokes. Now, in asham or achatas, those are karbanos which you are obligated to bring. Still, you choose which animal is going to be the asham and the achatas, and therefore you are making the neder, you are making the kedusha and the isser upon it. That's really up to you, even though you're obligated to bring it. That, the Gemara explains, everyone agrees you can be matfis. And the level below that would be, of course, a neder where you get to make the neder up altogether. That's something which is 100% a davar hanadur, and you could make another neder by being matfis, comparing something to that. So the Gemara says that our machlokes is over the concept of a bukhar, and it explains because you have two conflicting psukim, and one pasuk that says ki yidor. That means that you can only compare it to a davar hanadur, something which is also because of a neder. On the other hand, it says la Hashem, which is to include things which are innately aser. So you have one pasuk that's limiting it, one pasuk that is including other things which are innately aser. How do you do this? So one opinion says the only thing which is excluded is level 4, nevelas and trefus. That's a davar aser. That's what's excluded from ki yidor. Everything else is included, you could, and therefore even a bachar is included from la Hashem, and you are allowed to make it. You can be matfis, make something else aser, make a neder on something else by linking it to level 3, even to a bachar. Now the Gemara explains that this opinion holds is that even though the bachar has an innate kedusha, it has kedusha even if you don't give it. However, there is a mitzvah for you to give kedusha. It's a mitzvah for you to be makdish it, and therefore you do have some level of neder aspect to kedusha's bachar. Now the other opinion holds that bachar, because it has innate kedusha and it's not up to you to be makdish it, therefore it's also excluded from being able to be used for atfasa from the pasuk of ki yidor. What's included in Lashem? That's only including level 2, only chatas and asham. And there's a chiddush in that you could be matfis to chatas and asham because you're obligated to bring the chatas and asham. You can't just avoid it. However, there it's much more of a davar hanada because you're the one who chose the animal, and that's what's included in the pasuk of La Hashem. Now, this opinion holds, the Gemara says, that since you can't choose not to be makdish your bachar, it doesn't count. The Gemara quotes the pasuk that says that even though there's a mitzvah to be makdish the bachar, it has automatic kedusha because it says hazachar takdish. The Gemara now moves on to quote a brisa. Then we'll have our next Mishnah, and then another brisa. The Gemara is going to compare them all. The Gemara is going to try to stack up the shitas of who holds what and who is the author of each brisa. In order to keep this straight, it's important to keep in mind that there are three disputes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, and all of them are going to be relevant to figure out who wrote the brisa and who wrote the Mishnah. The three disputes are as follows. First of all, do we say mechalavat shomei hein if you say that the food which you are not eating is not a carbon? For example, does that mean the food that you are eating is a carbon? Can you derive from something you said is not what something else is? According to Rabbi Meir, you can't do that, so you cannot make a neder by saying something's not a neder, and that'll apply something else is. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you could do that. That's a machlokas which we've seen discussed a number of times. Second machlokas is if you're going to compare your apple to something which is usr, not a name of an isser, but something, an object which is usr, like a sheep, which is usr because it's a carbon, or like the wood on the mizbeach, which is usr because it's kachim. If you're going to do that, do you have to say like? According to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to say like. You have to say ki ishim. According to Rabbi Meir, you don't have to say like. The third question is when you are saying the phrase lekarbon loy ochelacha, how do you mean that? Do you mean to say that it's not a carbon what I'm not going to eat from you, or do you mean to say that this is a carbon and therefore I won't eat it? According to Rabbi Meir, that's what you mean, and therefore it's a valid phraseology of an isser. So now, let's go through the brisa, the Mishnah, and the brisa, and see how everything works out case by case. So let's start with the brisa. The brisa begins with somebody who wants to make a few things usher as a neder by comparing it to parts that go on the mizbeach or karbanos. And again, he's not talking about a name isser. He's not talking about the isser treif or anything like that. He's not talking about pigul or noser or something like that. He's talking about an object which is aser. So he says a sheep. He says it's a sheep or it's la imra. So he says imra, a sheep, or la imra, it's to the sheep, or ki imra, it's like a sheep, or it's dirim, la dirim, ki dirim, that's an enclosure, or it's eitim, la eitim, ki eitim, those are the wood on the mizbeach, or ishim, la ishim, ki ishim, that's the fires on the mizbeach, or he says mizbeach, la mizbeach, ka mizbeach, the mizbeach itself, or heichal, la heichal, ka heichal, that's the building of the Beis Hamikdash, and is referring to the Ketorahs brought inside, or it says Yerushalayim, li Yerushalayim, ki Yerushalayim. All these things, the brisa here gives the psak. If he ends off and he says she'ochalacha, that all this applies to the food of yours that I'm going to eat, it's a valid isser. This is obviously Rabbi Meir's opinion, because Rabbi Meir is the one who holds you don't have to say ki. If you're comparing it to an object, you don't have to use the conjunction like. So this part of the brisa is definitely Rabbi Meir and not Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the next part of the brisa is where he ends off, where he says imra la imra kimra, instead of saying she'ochelcha, the food which of yours which I am going to eat, he says lo ochelcha, the food which I'm not going to eat. And the brisa says that's not a valid neder. So that makes sense according to Rabbi Yehuda, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're answering that which you're not going to eat. That's irrelevant, and therefore, what's a neder about this? However, according to Rabbi Meir, like we said, we understand that phrase differently. When he says la carbon lo ochelecha, we understand that to mean this is a carbon, and therefore I'm not going to eat it. So how does this phrase in the brisa fit with Rabbi Meir if he doesn't hold of that? Rabbi Meir should hold that this is a valid isser, but the brisa rules that it is not a valid isser. It's not valid in making the neder, but according to the way Rabbi Meir understands this phrase, it should work. So the Gemara answers is the difference between what the lamed is vowelized as. Is it la imra or li imra? If it's la imra, then it's saying loy imra. It's not a sheep, and he's therefore saying it's not usr, that which I'm not eating. That's irrelevant, and you cannot reread that. However, if he says li imra, then he's saying this is a sheep, that which I am eating, and we interpret that as this is a sheep, therefore I am not eating it, and that is a valid lashon of making the neder, and that's how this fits in Rabbi Meir. A very similar answer to a similar question which we gave on the last daf. Now we introduce the Mishnah, where we're going to have the same problem. Who is the author of the Mishnah? So let's read the Mishnah carefully. So the Mishnah starts off by saying, The Mishnah contains 3 cases, and some of them it says who the author is. So it begins by saying someone says, Carbon, Ola, Mincha, Chatas, Toda, or Shlamim. It says all of these things, and he ends off, that which I eat of yours. So that's a valid neder, it's good, according to the Mishnah doesn't say who, and Rabbi Huda says it's not. So obviously the one who says that it's good is Rabbi Meir, because he's the one who holds you don't have to say ki. You're comparing it to these things, you don't have to say like. And therefore, all those languages where you say carbon or any of these other ones, that which I eat from you, you're making an isser. But Rabbi Huda not, because you left out the ki. You left out the chaf. Now, the next phrase in the Mishnah is very similar. It says that if he says ha-carbon, ki-carbon, or carbon, that which I eat from you, ha-carbon, ki-carbon, carbon, sha'ochalocha, there it does create a valid isser. Again, this is Rabbi Meir's opinion. It's pretty much repeating what we said before. And the only reason this is repeated is because here you have to, it's emphasizing you have to end off sha'ani ochalocha, in contrast to the next phrase. The next phrase is where he says lik-carbon. Now, if he says a carbon, then he's saying that it is a carbon. Then either way he ends off, it's a neder, according to Rabbi Meir. And if you put Rabbi Meir's opinions, you'll see why. So first of all, if he ends off le carbon shani ochalacha, oh, very good. You're saying that the food that you're going to eat is aser, like a carbon. Great, that works. If you say le carbon lo ochalacha, then we interpret it as follows. This is a carbon, therefore I'm not going to eat from you. And that's also a lashon of a carbon, and therefore either way it's a carbon, whether you say lo carbon shani ochalacha or lo carbon lo ochalacha. And therefore this is listed separately in the Mishnah as a separate case, distinctly from the case before, and it's aser. Now, the Gemara begins by pointing out that the beginning, the first case is Rabbi Meir, as we said. The Gemara says, Kasha, why does ha-carbon work? We have a brisa that says, and this is our next brisa, that the Chachamim, which is Rabbi Meir, agreed to Rabbi Huda that the phrase ha-carbon, 2 separate words, ha-carbon, or ha-ola, or ha-mincha, or ha-chatas, all of them ending off she'ochalcha, that which I eat from you, that is not a valid neder. And the reason is because we interpret that as, by the carbon, I'm not going to eat from you. Or by the carbon, I'm going to eat from you. Ha'ola means you're swearing by the carbon. Swearing by the carbon is meaningless. So therefore, it's not a valid neder. So we want to know why when it says ha-carbon, one word, why is that? Okay, it also sounds like you're swearing by the carbon. So the Gemara explains, it's only true if it's 2 words. If it's ha-carbon. If it's ha-carbon, we don't view it that way. We view it as if you're saying like the carbon. Now, the Gemara just explains again that which we had said, la carbon, la ochalacha. We had initially thought that you would read that as la carbon, it's not a carbon, la ochalacha, what I'm not going to eat of yours, which implies that it is a carbon, what I am going to eat of yours, and that's where the neder is valid. The Gemara asks, Rabbi Meir can't hold that way. Rabbi Meir doesn't hold mechal avat shemehe, and you can't do derived implications like that. And the Gemara explains it's not how you read it. You read it as lik carbon, therefore lo ochalacha. And that is a valid carbon, as we said before. Now we get to our next Mishnah, which is a new topic. It's the last Mishnah in the Perek. It gives a halacha, and then we'll question it and explain it. So the halacha is if somebody says to his friend, konam, it's a language of shua, as we had said, a language of making a neder. And he says, konam pi medabri imach, my mouth speaking to you, yadai oisa imach, my hands working for you, ragli malachas imach, my foot from walking with you. So in all these expressions, it's a valid neder and an isser is created. So Gemara wants to know, how does that work? There's a difference between a neder and a shvua. As we said, a neder can only catch on an object. A neder asers the actual object itself, not the person. So it can only catch on an object. If somebody tries to make a neder on an activity, you can't. You can only make a shvua on an activity. Conversely, you can only make a neder, you can only aser an object which is a mitzvah with a neder. So you can make an isser, let's say you could say that it's aser for me to go into my sukkah because my sukkah is aser. But you can't make a shvua, you're not going to go into your sukkah because then you're making a shvua, you're not going to keep a mitzvah, which doesn't count. So our question is, how in all these cases he's making a neder against an activity? He's making a neder against speaking, working, or walking. That shouldn't work. You can only do a shvua for that. So the answer is there is a way of doing it. He says, my mouth is usher to talk to you. My feet are also to walk with you. My hands are also to work for you. And he's putting the Isser on the object, mouth, hands, feet. And that you could do. The Gemara says, if you look carefully in the wording of the Mishnah, it's clear that way. It doesn't say, I'm not going to talk to you. He says, my mouth from talking to you. And therefore, definitely it's being called on the object and not on the person. This concludes the first parak of the Masechta. And now we begin the second parak ve'elu mutar. And this begins listing the types of languages of a neder that do not work. So it contains one case that it doesn't work because it's just not a valid lashon, and all the other cases is because someone is trying to link to something which is innately usser, and you can't link to that to make a neder. So the Mishnah begins, and it says, this is a invalid neder. Somebody says, chulin sha'ochalacha. It's chulin, meaning it's mutter, that which I eat. Okay, so you're saying it's mutter, there's no problem, there's no implication of any neder involved over there. Now we have all the cases that are not a neder because they're nately usser. And in that it talks about the meat of a pig, avodah zarah meat, an animal that had its heart removed, that is a practice of avodah zarah. Nevelos, that's animals that weren't slaughtered. Trephos, animals which were sick. Shkatzim or masim, those are creepy crawlies, other forbidden animals. Chala of Kohanim. Truma, also of Kohanim. Now I have an interesting one. Somebody says to his wife, you're like my mother. You're like my mother. He's saying, you're usher on me, just like my mother is usher on me. So that neder doesn't work also. However, here, midrabanan, we make him get a heter for the neder, because we don't want people to get into a habit of creating such nedarim or treating them lightly. Again, the Gemara asks, who is the author of this Mishnah? So the Gemara says, this one has to be Rabbi Yehuda. Why? The Mishnah started off by saying, if someone says, chulin sha'ochalacha, it's not a proper iser. That implies, had he said, loy chulin sha'ochalacha, it's not chulin, that which I'm eating of yours, that would imply that it's not chulin, but it is carbon. Therefore, he's saying that what I'm eating of yours is a carbon, and that is a valid iser. The problem is that's Mechlal Avat Shemiyah Hein. We already said that Rameir doesn't hold that way. So it has to be Rabbi Yehuda. So what's the kasha? Okay, it's Rabbi Yehuda. The kasha is it's almost that phrase we already saw in a Mishnah in the first parak. So why is it being repeated? So the Gemara is going to give a number of answers. We'll only do one here on this daf because we're already into the next page. And that's the answer that the Gemara says, you really didn't need it here just because we were listing invalid nedarim. We threw this one in already because we mentioned it already.